All right, Shabbos say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. So today's daf is Yud Beis, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Yud Aleph Amud Beis, 11b Tani Chada. So we're picking up. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up from the bottom. Mostly just to thank our sponsors for today's shir. Baruch Hashem, we have a number of them to thank. The Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, the Learner Mishpacha, for dedicating all of the learning Shiurim and Drashos this month in memory of Mrs. Dina Lerner Gerber, Dina Bas Yehuda Leib. We also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the learning this week in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah ben Zechariah and Dina Bas Pesach. We thank Avi Zeisman for dedicating the learning this week in memory of his father, Michael ben Yechiel. We have a day of learning dedicated today by Dr. Yaakov and Ruth Gordon in memory of Yaakov's mother, Devora Bas Yaakov. And we also thank two special Daf Yomi sponsors, an anonymous sponsor, the Ilui Nishmas Michael ben David and Mordechai Malki Tusk, for dedicating the shir this morning in celebration of Betzalel's bar mitzvah. Betzalel is a sweet boy from our shul. His bar mitzvah is supposed to be this Shabbos in shul, but in Meretz Hashem will take place b'Sha'at Tovo Metzlachas at a future time. We celebrate with Betzalel. We celebrate with the Tusk Mishpacha over this incredibly important milestone. And I will say with that, let us begin. So as I mentioned before, a beautiful daf ahead of us today. We are picking up again 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up from the bottom. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we ended yesterday's daf with a fascinating machlokus between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Namely, if you carry something in a non-normative fashion, so what is the halacha? So Rabbi Meir said, every person essentially has the same halachos of otzah, the same halachos of carrying. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, if there's a normative way to carry and a non-normative way to carry. If you're carrying in the normative way, you're chayiv. Non-normative way, you are pater. Rabbi Yehuda made an interesting chilik, and Rabbi Yehuda explained that halacha l'maisa, it could be that there are different ways to carry. Namely, that if something could be normal for one particular individual, let's say an uman, a craftsman, will carry for example, the tailor will carry his needle stuck in his garment. So for the tailor, that's called normal derech hotzah. That's called the normative fashion. For someone else, that would not be normative. So Rabbi Yehuda understands the model being that halacha l'maisa, so kind of the definition of normal carrying may be subjective person to person. So the Gemara goes on, Tani chada, lo yetzi hazav b'kiso, v'im yatza pater. So we'll say in an interesting halacha over here, there's a concept that the zav, so a person, a zav is someone who has some type of emission, non-seminal emission. Now, depending on the number of emissions and the frequency of emissions, ultimately, again, we'll go ahead and determine his particular status. So what the zav actually used to wear was like a kiss, a pouch that was tied around the male member in order to be able to catch any emissions. So the truth is, that was done really for two reasons, as we're going to see. That was done, number one, to be able for him to see the emissions, to see if there was in fact an emission. And number two, also to keep his clothing from getting soiled. We'll see those two parts in just a bit. So the Gemara says as follows. Tani Chada, one opinion says, Lo yetzi hazav b'kiso. A zav should not go out with this kiss, with this pouch attached to him on Shabbos. Vim yatsa, and if he did so, pater aval aser. So if he did so, it is aser midrabanan. It is rabbinically prohibited. V'tanya idach, lo yetzi v'im yatsa chayiv chatas. Another brayso says that if he wore it outside, not only are you not allowed to do it, but if you did it, it is a biblical prohibition. It's a chayiv chatas. So we'll say, so which one is it? Is it mutar or is it aser? Remember, pater aval aser means it's aser midrabanan, but pater midoraisa. That's the first brayso. Second brayso, totally mutar. So which one is it? To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef lo kasha, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say it could very well be very, very simple. It's machlokas Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Namely, Rabbi Meir was the one who said that there is one din of hotzah for everyone. Since this is a non-normative method of carrying, therefore the zav will be pater. Rabbi Huda, on the other hand, holds that no, that the truth is the laws of Hotzah are subjective. For a regular person, this type of carrying would be abnormal, but for a zav, this type of carrying is normal, and therefore halacha l'maaseh he is chayiv. To which the Gemara says, Abaye, 1 second. Amar de shamas le Rabbi Meir b'midi delav hainu arche b'midi de hainu arche mi shamas le. They both say even Rabbi Meir understands that when something is quote unquote considered normative, even if it's not the normal derech, you're still chayav. What do I mean by that? So, for example, Rabbi Meir will say that halacha l'maisa for a zav, the normal way for a zav to conduct himself is to go ahead and have this pouch tied to him. See, even though this might not be the derech for other people, for a zav it is the derech. Therefore, by definition, if you're a zav and you're walking out with this kiss, this is your normal derech, and therefore you should be chayiv. After all, the ilo temahachi, because if you say that the halacha does not really allow for any deviation from a normal standard, so according to Rabbi Meir, if someone were to make a hole in a piece of wood, so let's say, for example, a carpenter, when he makes a hole in a piece of wood, it looks one way, it looks professional. So you're going to say that you're only chayiv for a professionally created hole in a piece of wood. It's not true. Even if a regular person were to go ahead and drill the hole, halacha l'maaseh be chayiv as well, even though it's imperfect. So in other words, the Gemara is saying is, even according to Rabbi Meir, there's an understanding that even within the realm of normative, there are still cases that are, we'll call it non-normative normative. I know that's you feel free to use that term whenever you want, right? The non-normative normative. So a zav is a perfect example of this. So it's not normal to walk around with a kiss tied to the male member. I think we're all in agreement on that. But Lamaisa, thank you for the head nods. I appreciate that. But the idea is that for a zav, this is totally normal. For a zav, this is his normal. This is his darko b'kach. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, even Rabbi Meir should know that you're chayiv. Ela amar avamuna lo kashya, kan bezav bal shtei re'iyas, kan bezav bal gimor re'iyas. Oh, so the Gemara says something very interesting. So maybe the chiluk is like this. Maybe the chiluk is how many re'iyos, how many emissions the zav has had. You see, if the zav had 2 re'iyos, then the pouch is very necessary to catch the 3rd emission, which makes him a zav gadol. Versus if he already had 3 emissions, it could very well be that the pouch itself is to a certain degree a bit unnecessary, as halacha l'maaseh is already a zav gadol. To which the Gemara says, "Maishna zav bal shtei re'iyos techayiv to mi baile bedika zav bal gimel nami mi baile l'sira." But it says, no, that's not true. Just like the zav who had 2 emissions needs the pouch in order to catch the 3rd emission, the zav ultimately, again, who has had 3 emissions, still requires the pouch for Shiva Nikiyim. Remember again, the zav who has 3 emissions is counting 7 clean days. Those 7 clean days must be clean, i.e. without emission. So the pouch is necessary ultimately again to make sure that he hasn't had an emission. To which the Gemara says, Lo nitzucha ela lebo bayom. So it could be that the case where the machlokis comes up is in a situation ultimately where what? Where the zav had his 3rd emission, and that 3rd emission is on Shabbos, and he's wearing the pouch on Shabbos. And now for the rest of that day, after the 3rd emission, that's not one of the Shiva Nikiyim. That's not going to be ultimately one of the clean days, because halacha l'maaseh, you can't start the clean days until the next day. So therefore, it could very well be that in a situation like that, that would be the machlokes. Rabbi Meir ultimately, I should say, one brisa says that you're pater, one brisa says that you're chayiv. But one sec, let's transition. Isn't the pouch always necessary? After all, again, as we mentioned before, the pouch serves a secondary purpose, which is to keep clothing clean. Right? The pouch ensures that halacha l'maisa, one's clothing doesn't become soiled because of any emissions. Amar Rabbi Zera, hay tanahu da amar kolatzule tinof lo kachashiv. Both say, so this opinion holds that ultimately going ahead and saving clothing from becoming dirty is not chashiv. Ultimately, again, this is not the derech hotzah. In other words, both say, essentially what we're saying is as follows. Halacha l'maisa, in order to go ahead and be chayiv for hotzah, and we're going to see this come out a bit more, that you have to do a malacha hatzricha legufa, right? A normative halacha. So the normative halacha of carrying, for example, is to transport something from point A to point B. But to carry something whose intention is not to get from point A to point B, but the only reason you're carrying it is why? Is in order to go ahead and save your clothing from getting soiled. That's not called the normative act of hotzah, and therefore one would not be chayiv. The Gemara says, for example, now the truth is, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in that, but for our purposes right now, what the Gemara is saying is as follows, is that halacha lamaisa, this is not the derech hotzah. Derech hotzah, a normative act of transferring an item is, I want to get it from point A to point B. But to carry something because I'm carrying it to keep my clothing from getting soiled, that's not the normative hotzah. The Gemara says, I'll tell you how we know this. This nan, we learned, hakofik ara ala kosel. If a person goes ahead and places a plate on top of a wall, now the truth is, the reason a person is doing this is why it's raining on the wall, and a person is placing, we'll see, a person is placing a plate on the wall. In bishvil shetuda chakaira, if you're placing the plate on the wall because you want the plate to get washed off, therefore what? Hareze bechiyutan. So we'll say very quickly, we know the halacha is that in order for most items to be makabel tumah, they must first become receptive to tumah. How do you become receptive to tumah? You come in contact with liquid. But in order for liquid to ultimately make something receptive, to be makabel tumah, that liquid has to be what we call wanted, right? It has to be necessary. If it's, necessary is the wrong word. It has to be, we'll call it a premeditated placement. So for example, the Gemara says as follows, it's raining. I place a plate on top of the wall. It's raining now on top of the plate. The water comes out of the plate and falls onto, let's say, food items. So now the shaila is, are the food items ra'i lekabel tumah? So the Gemara says it's very simple. It's very simple. If halacha lamaisa, do you want the water or not? Do you want the rainwater or not? So the Gemara says like this: if you want the rainwater in that, I'm putting the plate on top of the wall in order for the plate to get washed. That means I want the water. If I want the water, then that water has the capacity when it falls onto other food items to make them ra'ui lekabel tumah. Harezi b'chiyutan. That means it makes it ra'ui lekabel tumah. Im b'shvil, top of your base. Im b'shol shlo yilaka akosel. But if at the end of the day you're putting the plate there in order to protect the wall from rainfall, then eino b'chiyutan. Then ultimately, again, the water does not have the ability to make something ra'i lekabel tumah, which makes sense. Why? Because here the plate is there. Why? The plate is there in order to protect the wall from water, i.e. you don't want the water. So because you don't want the water in any way, therefore it doesn't have the capacity to make something ra'i lekabel tumah. So once you hear the chilik, if I want the water and then I'm placing the plate on the wall so that the plate will get cleaned, then when the water comes off the plate and falls, let's say, onto food, it makes that food ra'i lekabel tumah because I quote unquote wanted that water. If, however, I only placed the plate on top of the wall in order ultimately to what? To protect the wall, it means I don't want the water. If I don't want the water, then when the water trickles off the plate and falls onto food items, it doesn't have the ability to make it ra'i lekabel tumah. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second, midami, how can you compare the two cases? Hasam lo kabay lahani mashkin klal. So you're say, in this case, here's what I know. I don't want the water at all, meaning I never want the liquid. I never want the liquid. The Gemara is trying to compare this case to the kiss, to the pouch of the zav. In this case, I don't want the water at all. But really, I do want the kiss over here. In other words, I want the pouch because I need the pouch ultimately, again, to collect any potential emission. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Halo dami ela seifa. The reality is the case of the zav is only comparable to the seifa of the brayso. Areva shiara dalaf l'socha. So we'll say, if you have a bowl and ultimately rainwater poured into the bowl, mayim hanitsin v'hanitsin einan b'chiyutan. If water comes into the bowl and kind of splashes out of it, that water does not have the ability to make something else ra'ui lekabel tumah. Ella Abayi v'Rava Damrit Abayu. So we'll say, so therefore that's the case the Gemara wants to compare it to. Ella Abayi v'Rava Damrit Abayu lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Ha Rabbi Yehuda v'ha Rabbi Shimon. In reality, I will say the Gemara says that these two prices by Zov, ultimately, again, are reflective of two different opinions. Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon. We'll say, what does this mean? The Tani Rabbi Shmuel. So I'm sorry. We'll say, so look at Rashi for just a moment. Ha Rabbi Huda, the Amar Malacha shenetzricha legufa shebertsono lo sasa ve'no tzarich leikar tachlisa ki hacha sheno tzarich leziva zu sha'al yada bahakis azav va'afapikin chayiv alayu b'matzniya gaimote mestame. So also listen to this. So the Gemara now suggests, I'll just say this quickly outside, the Gemara now suggests that in fact these two braisos, remember, let's keep our eye on the kiss, right? So remember again, at the end of the day, what do you have over here? That didn't come out right, I realize as I said that. I'll say, so the idea being you have two braisos. What one brisa says that if the Zav goes out with the kiss on Shabbos, he's pater alav asur. One brisa says that halacha l'maisa is chayiv midaraisa. So how do we reconcile it? So a couple of different approaches. The Gemara finally comes down to, this is a machlokes, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon. The Rebbe will say, we haven't seen this yet, but this is going to be one of the most yesodistic machloksim in Shabbos. What do you do regarding a malacha she'ina tzricha legufa? Which means as follows. A malacha done, but not for its intended purpose. In other words, every malacha has a particular purpose. What happens if you do actionally, you perform the malacha, but you're not doing it for the purpose of the actual malacha? Here's a perfect example. The hotzah, as we mentioned before. The malacha, what is the malacha of hotzah, of transferring an item? To get something from point A to point B. What happens if you do the malacha of hotzah? I actively carry something from point A to point B, but I'm not doing it for the intention of moving something from point A to point B. I'm just doing it for a different purpose. I'll say, what kind of case is that? The kiss and the zav. The zav is wearing the kiss that is attached to him. And what happens? So he's moving it from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, but that's not his intention. His intention is to catch any kind of emissions. This is called a malacha shenetzricha legufa. And this becomes a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda holds that you are chayiv for a malacha shenetzricha legufa. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda would hold that halacha l'maisa, the zav is chayiv mid'oraisa for transporting the kiss, versus Rabbi Shimon, who holds that one is pater for a malacha she'ina tzricha legufa. That if you do a malacha but you don't do it for the intended purpose, that halacha l'maisa you are pater. So Rabbi says the Gemara therefore explains that there's no stira, there's no disagreement or contradiction ultimately between the braisos, but rather again, it reflects two different opinions. So again, the Gemara doesn't resolve that machlokes, as Rashi points out. We'll see that machlokes in Daf Tzadik Tes. We'll get to that later. Good. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. Yotze Adam b'tefillin be'erev Shabbos im chashecha. An interesting halacha. A person is permitted to wear his tefillin outside on erev Shabbos, even in the twilight period before Shabbos. So also remember again, just to contextualize this a bit. So remember, we got introduced to our Mishnah regarding a whole variety of things that you're not allowed to do in the moments, right, in the time leading up to Shabbos. Why? Out of a concern that you may forget once Shabbos arrives, and you may end up carrying something, right? So the tailor can't go out with his needle, the scribe can't go out with his quill, v'chulei v'chulei. The Gemara now says, however, you are permitted to go ahead and wear your tefillin out. You could wear your tefillin on Erev Shabbos, even very close to Shabbos, and we're not concerned that once Shabbos starts, you're going to come to inadvertently carry your tefillin. What's the reason for that? Rashi says, we're not worried that you're going to come to carry them out on Shabbos. Now, I want to point something out over here. The Gemara is not in any way focusing on wearing tefillin on Shabbos. Wearing tefillin on Shabbos is a different discussion. But the idea over here is you're allowed to wear your tefillin in the period leading up to Shabbos, right before Shabbos, and we're not concerned that you're going to come to wear them out to a different Rosh Hashanah Shabbos. So remember again, so the tailor, already the half hour before Shabbos has to put down his needle. The scribe, already the half hour before Shabbos, has to put down his quill. But tefillin, we're not worried. You could wear right up until Shabbos. My taima, this is beautiful. Kevan da Amara Baravuna Chayiv Adam Lamashmesh B'Tfilin Kol Shah Mishah Kal V'Chomer Mitzitz. Because Rabbi says, since a person has to be acutely aware of his tefillin every single moment, literally means Rabbi say that a person is supposed to touch his tefillin every moment to remind himself of the presence of his tefillin and to remind himself of the kiddush. In other words, tefillin always has a heightened level of cognitive awareness. The whole idea of the things that you can't carry samach l'Shabbos is out of a fear that you're going to forget that you're carrying it. But who could ever forget that they're wearing tefillin? Tefillin requires active cognitive awareness at every single moment. Where do we know this from? Kal v'chomer mitzitz. The tzitz, remember again, was the little golden plate that the Kohen wore on his forehead that said Kodesh Lashem. Matzitz she'in bo ela askara achos. The tzitz, which only has one name of Hashem on it. Amra Torah v'haya amitzcho tamid. Yet the Torah says it shall be forever on his forehead. Shelo yasiach daito mimenu. The idea is that the Kohen Gadol must have an active awareness, active cognitive awareness of the tzitz at all times. Tefillin, sheyesh ba en askaras harbe alachas kama v'kama. Tefillin, which have many names of God written inside of it, of course, one requires an active cognitive awareness. Hilchach midkar dakir luhu. Therefore, we'll say a person is always aware of his tefillin, and because he is always aware of his tefillin, therefore, halacha l'maisa, we are not concerned that he will inadvertently forget about it and come to carry it on Shabbos. Beautiful. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tanya, Chananya Omer, Chayiv Adam Lamashresh Bebigdo Erev Shabbos Im Chashecha. So now Chananya said a person is obligated to check his pockets. Lamashresh Bebigdo, check your pockets Erev Shabbos to make sure that you're not carrying anything. Person has to do that before Shabbos begins. Amar Rav Yosef Hilchasa Rabasi l'Shabbos. Chananya has said a very important halacha for Shabbos. Davar Gadol, Rashi says. This is very important. Check your pockets before Shabbos starts, ultimately in order to ensure that one does not come to inadvertently carry on Shabbos. The Gemara goes weiter. Lo yifale adam es kelef. So remember again, the Mishnah said you should not delouse your clothing on Shabbos. Excuse me. You should not delouse your clothing on Shabbos. Says the Gemara. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah itself was a little bit ambiguous because the Mishnah said that on one hand, you're not supposed to read la'or haner. One should not read by the light of the candle. And then it said, v'lo yifali adam es begado, be'es bekela. A person should not delouse his clothing. So it's not exactly clear, is this a din in shifting the candle? Is that what this is about? Like we saw in yesterday's daf, they were concerned that you're going to move the oil towards the wick, and that's havara, or is this an issue of delousing? So it says the Gemara Bailuhu, lo yifale as kelov bayom shema yiharig. A person should not go ahead and delouse his clothing on Shabbos out of a concern that a person will come to kill the louse. And killing the louse is a problem ultimately of shchita, of killing, right? You can't kill on Shabbos. Rabbi Elazar, Tisanya, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Hahori Kina b'Shabbos Kila Hore Gomel. Right, and this reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer holds that if you kill a louse on Shabbos, it's like you killed a camel. The idea being that there's no difference between killing a louse and going ahead and killing a large animal. You can't kill a louse on Shabbos either. V'lo yikra la'or haner shemayata. And similarly, so does that mean, and therefore you can't read by candlelight, because let's remember again, when they say candlelight, they're really referring to like what they call a nair is not a candle like we have. What they call a nair is more like a little bit of a lantern. What it was, I think I mentioned this a few days ago, it was a receptacle that had a little lip at the end. The lip had an indentation. In the receptacle, you place the oil. In the lip, you lay down the wick, and the wick comes out. So the idea would be you'd light the wick. The wick draws oil from the receptacle. If the fire would not be burning as bright, what you would do is you would tilt the receptacle so that ultimately, again, the wick draws more oil. The problem with that is shifting oil towards the wick is a problem of havara, is a problem ultimately again of kindling. So the Gemara says when it says that you should v'lo yikra la'or haner shemayata. So on one hand, we could be saying two things. The Mishnah is teaching me, number one, you can't delouse on Shabbos. Why can't you delouse on Shabbos? Because delousing will end up in you killing the louse, killing the lice, and that's asr on Shabbos. And furthermore, you can't read by candlelight because you may come to shift the oil towards the wick. O Dilma, or maybe what the Mishnah is saying is, Tarvaihu Shemayata. Maybe you can't do either of these things. Maybe you can't delouse or read by the candlelight because both of them require light, and we're concerned that by both of them, you'll come to go ahead and move the utensil, moving the oil closer to the wick, thereby committing an act of havara. So which one is it? Tashma, in Poland, ve'in koren oraner. So the Brisa says, we don't delouse, nor do we read by the light of the candle. So we'll say what that sounds like, according to the Brisa, is that both delousing and reading by candlelight are both a din in candlelight. The idea being you can't do either of these things by the light of the ner, lest you come to go ahead and adjust the ner, which will be a problem of havar of kindling on Shabbos. The Gemara says, but one second, fine, that's a Brisa. But why is this Brisa any stronger than our Mishnah? Or is the Mishnah is ambiguous? So the fact that the Mishnah could be read a different way, why does the Brisa make it better? So the Gemara says, Tashma, here we go. Ein polin la'araner, ve'ein koren la'araner. One should not delouse by the light of the candle, nor should one read by the light of the candle. Elu min ha'alochos sha'amru ba'aliyas Chananya ben Chizkiya ben Garan. And I will say these are amongst the halachos that were said in the attic of Chizkiya, of Chananya ben Chizkiya ben Garan. So I'll say again, we'll see this event a little bit later. This idea that there were a certain number of halachos that were legislated in the attic of Chananya ben Chizkiya ben Garan. But the Gemara says, you see from your Shmamina, Tarvayu Shemayata Shmamina. I will say, what's the takeaway? You see from here that halacha lamaisa, both delousing as well as reading by the candlelight are both the same issue. The issue of shemayata. So you can't delouse your clothing on Shabbos because delousing was often done by candlelight. You can't read by candlelight, and the issue is the same by both of them. Namely, that halacha lemaisa, one may come to adjust the oil, move the oil towards the wick, which is a problem ultimately of havara. Amar Rabbi Shmuel, Shmuel says you can't even use candlelight. Let's say a person has an article of clothing and he's not sure if it's his or if it's his wife's. Okay, so I guess fashion has changed over time a little bit. So you're not sure if it's yours or if it's your wife's. So still, Allah is, you can't go and use the candlelight for that. Because again, we're concerned that if you use candlelight to discern the difference between A and B, you may come to adjust the light source. That's only true with the clothing of the people of Mechuzah. Because I will say the people of Mechuzah, they were not laborers. So because they were not laborers, ultimately what? They wore wider clothing. I guess laborers wore tighter fitting clothing. I guess higher class people, non-laborers, wore wider clothing. So Mechuzah, they weren't laborers. Therefore, both men and women had wider clothing. So in Mechuzah, maybe there's a difficulty telling the difference between a man's clothing and a woman's clothing. However, about the b'nei chaklisa made the yadi. But I will say for laborers, right, b'nei chaklisa, ultimately, again, the difference between men's clothing and women's clothing is easily discernible. And if you need a little extra light, so I will say what the Gemara is saying is like this. Anything which requires real inspection, anything which requires real, looking, intensive looking, that's when you can't use the light of the candle, because that's when we're concerned that you're going to need to adjust it in order to have more light. But if something just requires a relatively small amount of light, because the difference is pretty noticeable, you just need a little bit of light to help you, that's not so problematic. And even in Mechuzah, it's only clothing of men. Okay, Tan Rabbanan. In Poland, we do not delouse clothing in public out of kavod. I was about to say, the Gemara is saying over here that there are certain activities you don't engage in because they don't look nice. And it's not nice to other people in the public to see you doing them. So therefore, again, you have to be mindful of other people as well. So therefore, you don't delouse clothing in public because it's not bakavadik for the tzibor to see you delousing your clothing. So the Gemara says, Ein osin apiktuzin bershus harabit. So again, I will say you don't do this apiktuzin. What's the apiktuzin? Rashi says hakah. We'll say this would be when a person would cause themselves to throw up. So they used to have something to drink in order to be able to throw up. So we'll say, so it's interesting. So different interpretations of this. Some say people would do this. They would throw up in order to eat more, which is interesting. That must have been a societal thing. Others say that if a person just ate and they were feeling sick, and they felt that they needed to purge, they would have this thing that they would drink in order to cause them to throw up. So don't do this in public. Don't do this in public. It's a lack of it's a lack of kavod abrius. Mipnei kavod tanabanon hamafala eskelov. So we're back to delousing now. So just to be clear, up until now, the approach of the Gemara is that delousing is problematic, not because you're killing the louse, but because ultimately, again, your delousing requires candlelight, and it requires an incredible amount of light and right by the candle. And the concern is that if you're doing something right by the candlelight, you may come to adjust the candle, moving the oil towards the wick, and ultimately resulting in havara. That's where we're holding is the problem right now with delousing. So says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, Hamafalas Kelov, if a person is delousing his clothing on Shabbos, so this is going according to the opinion that one could do it, Model Vizorik Luvat Shal Yarog. What you do is you roll the louse. So apparently Rashi points out when you roll the louse, so it it paralyzes the louse for a little bit of time, and then you throw it away. But don't kill the louse. You're not allowed to kill the louse. Abba Shal Omer, no tel v'zorik l'vat shlo yimbo. Abba Shal says you can't even roll it, because if you roll it, you run the risk ultimately again of killing it. But you're allowed to pluck it off your clothing, and ultimately go ahead and throw it away. So the Gemara says, "Ubivat shlo yimlo." Okay, right? Amar Ravuna, halacha. Ravuna says the halacha is molel v'zorek. You're allowed to roll the lice. So when you roll it, you paralyze it. Therefore, again, it can't latch back onto the clothing, and you could throw it away. V'zeu kvodo afilu b'chol. And this is the right way to do things, even during the week. Even during the week. Rava mikatelu. So Rava ultimately again would kill a lice. He would kill lice. And he would kill lice even on Shabbos. Rava, shadilu l'kana demaya. Rava would throw the lice into a pail of water. So the Gemara says, Amalu Rav Nachman Laban say, Rav Nachman said to his daughters, Ketulin, go ahead and kill the lice. Va'ashmo'ina likala this sanvasi. And let me go ahead and hear the voice of my enemies. So apparently Rava did not like lice. So Rava went ahead and told his daughters to kill the lice. And again, you could kill them in a way, throw them in the water, throw them away, so that you could. I don't know that lice make any kind of noise. But the point that he was making is that halacha l'maisa kill the lice. So both say. So what I just want to point out over here something very interesting. So remember. So we have a couple of machloksim. So opinion number one says don't kill lice on Shabbos. Opinion number two says kill lice on Shabbos. And in the opinion that says that kill lice on Shabbos, so the shayla is, do you kill it directly? Do you just roll it, paralyze it, then throw it away? But what we don't know is, we understand why someone would say that you can't kill lice on Shabbos, because a louse is a living thing, and therefore you can't kill any living thing on Shabbos. It's shchita, it's the malach of shchita. So how can you say that you could go ahead and kill a louse? So let's see in just a moment. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Elazar says as follows. Ein harginas hamacholas b'Shabbos divrei Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maisa you cannot kill a louse on Shabbos. Ubeis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel says you are permitted. Beis Hillel says you are permitted. V'chein hayir Reb Shimon Elazar Omer v'shom Shimon Gamliel. We'll say similarly again in a list of things that machlokas Eisham Beis Hillel ein mishantchin es atinokos liares. You can't make a shidduch for your child on Shabbos. So we'll say, remember again, when the Gemara over is speaking about making a shidduch, it doesn't mean like, oh, I have an idea for your son, I have an idea for your daughter. Right? These were formal arrangements that people made. So you can't make a formal shidduch on Shabbos. Velo hatinok lelamdo sefer. Nor can you go ahead and arrange for a rebbe to teach your child Torah on Shabbos. In other words, and that would mean stipulating financial arrangements as well. V'ulamdo umnus. Nor can you go ahead and arrange for someone to teach your child a trade on Shabbos. Can't do these things. Now, both say, now the reason you can't do these things according to Beis Shammai is why? Because Beis Shammai says on Shabbos, you're not allowed to take care of mundane things. On Shabbos, you can't take care of your needs. Shabbos is about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Your needs are taken care of during the week, not on Shabbos Kodesh. That's Beis Shammai. Furthermore, again, Beis Shammai says, Ve'im menachem avelim. We don't console mourners on Shabbos. No nichem avelim. Ve'mevakrin cholin b'Shabbos. And you can't do bikar cholim on Shabbos. Now, both say, nichum avelim and bikar cholim, according to Beis Shammai, is a different reason. Why can't you do that on Shabbos? Because halacha ma'aseh Beis Shammai says it will engender sadness. It will engender sadness. So therefore, Beis Shammai says these are two different categories. So you can't go ahead and do all of these things. Arrange a shidduch, arrange a rebbe, arrange a trade, arrange a trade, right? All of these for your child on Shabbos. Why? Because again, the Gemara is basing itself on the pasuk of Mimtzo Chafatzecha. On Shabbos, you have to abstain from taking care of your own needs. Shabbos is about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shabbos is about the neshama, not about my own needs. Therefore, Shabbos you can't do, and you can't do Bikur Cholim, you can't do Nichum Avelim, because that's going to make you sad on Shabbos, detract from the Simcha of Shabbos. But in all of these things, Beis Hillel Matirim. Beis Hillel says it's permitted. So both say, so the idea over here is, why does Beis Hillel say it's permitted? Beis Hillel says, you can't take care on Shabbos of your needs, but you can take care of the needs of others, which is incredible. So you can make the shidduch for your child. You can arrange, ultimately, again, for someone to teach your child the trade. You can go ahead and do Bikur Cholim. You can do Nichum Avelim. Such an incredible idea. Beis Shammai says you can't take care of, Beis Hillel says you can't take care of your needs on Shabbos, but you absolutely can go ahead and take care of the needs of others on Shabbos. Then I both say, just back for a moment, ultimately again to the louse. So the Gemara did not explain why Beis Hillel holds that you could kill a louse. So actually, we will see it later on, but it comes down to the idea of very, very quickly. Rashi points out in Matirin, Rashi says, we're going to see this Sugyan Kov Zayin of the days. Rashi explains that the reason, according to Beis Hillel, you could kill a louse on Shabbos is because the prohibition. The Isra to kill an animal on Shabbos is only an animal that reproduces. But an animal that does not reproduce, one is not chai for killing it on Shabbos. Now, it was the understanding of that time that lice do not reproduce. Now, the truth is, lice do reproduce. So we'll see what to do with this a little bit later on. Again, we'll see this. Do me a favor. We're going to get to this Kuf Zayin Amud Beis. No killing of lice until we get to Kuf Zayin Amud Beis, right? We're going to see the sugya in depth. We'll understand it. But Lamais, again, that's the machlokes over here. So Beis Shammai says you can't kill lice. Beis Hillel says you can kill lice. And lice are different because ultimately they don't reproduce, therefore not subject to the halachos of shchita. How to reconcile shitas Beis Hillel? How to reconcile that, which is the halacha l'maisa, with the reality we know today. In Meretz Hashem, we'll see. There's a lot of Torah on that. We'll get to that later. But I will say, now we transition to a different sugya. And in this different sugya on Shabbos is two things. So first of all, we have fundamental machlokes Beis Shammai as to what needs you're allowed to attend to on Shabbos. Beis Shammai essentially says anything related to you or your family, right? Your personal needs, you can't deal with that on Shabbos, right? That's for during the week. Beis Hillel says no. Your own needs. I can't talk about, let's say, my job. I can't arrange for things for me. That I can't do on Shabbos. But Lamaisa, to be able to do things for my child or someone else, that I could do on Shabbos. I can make a shidduch for my child. I can arrange someone to teach him a trade. I can arrange for someone to teach him Torah. That's for someone else. I could do Bikur Cholim. I could do Nichum Avelim. Why? Because Beis Hillel says, incredible idea. Beis Hillel says when it comes to doing for your fellow Jew, no day is off limits. When it comes to doing for yourself, there are days you can't take care of your own needs. When it comes to doing for someone else, every day, and every moment is a time ultimately to take care of your fellow Jew. Such an incredible yisod. Tan Rabbanon, hanichnas levakir asachola. If someone goes in to do Bikur Cholim. Now, I will say this is not a case. This is going according to Beis Hillel, who holds that you could do Bikur Cholim on Shabbos. I will say now the truth is, we don't do Nichum Avelim on Shabbos for a different reason, because comforting mourners on Shabbos would be a form of public mourning. So we don't engage in public mourning practices on Shabbos. So we'll see that a little bit later on as well. So let's say a person goes in to do Bikur Cholim. Person goes in to go ahead and visit a sick person on Shabbos. Omer, here's what you say: Shabbos himilizok urefua krovo lavo. Person says, Shabbos we don't cry out, because on Shabbos we don't really ask our needs. So on this Shabbos, I can't actively daven for you specifically, but ultimately, again, refuah kravalava. So we don't call out, we don't petition God with our personal needs on Shabbos, or refuah kravalava. But I'm confident, ultimately, again, that your refuah is going to come soon. I think I saw Avron Elbaum on this on the Zoom conference, our Gabbai, right? Yerachmi Abak, our Gabbaim. So remember, again, we all know this phrase. This is it: Shabbos imilizok refuah kravalava. We say this. This is what we say in our Mishaberachs for Shabbos. So what's in the Mishaberachs we have today? Mamish come from this lashon. Meir says that a person says to the chola, if you're mechabet Shabbos in the right way, ultimately again Shabbos will have Shabbos, will ultimately again ensure that you will not suffer. Amud Beis, Rabbi Huda Omer, Hamakom Yirachim Alecha V'Achol Yisrael. If you visit someone on Shabbos, the lashon you should say is HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have compassion on you and on all of the sick of Israel. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Hamakom Yirachim Alecha B'Soch Chole Yisrael. Rabbi Yossi says, what do you say? Hamakom HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have compassion on you in the midst of those who are ill within Klal Yisrael. Shevna ish Yerushalayim bichnisasa Omer. When Shevna, the man of Yerushalayim. Rabbi Yossi, can you imagine being known as the Ish Yerushalayim? You know, people have many titles throughout life. Imagine being known as Shevna Ish Yerushalayim. What is chos? So bichnisasa Omer Shalom. Ultimately, again, when he would come in to visit the Chola, he would say Shalom, Shalom Alecha, Shalom Alecha. Ubiyitziyasa Omer Shabbos or Shabbos Shalom, right? He would guide, or and Biyitziyasa, when he would go out, he would say Shabbos Himilizok, Urfua Kravalavo, Verachamav Merubin, Vishifto Bishalom. So when he would come into the Chola, he would say Shalom Aleichem or Shabbat Shalom, right? He would wish them a sense of peace. And when he would leave, he would say, Shabbos Similizok, although on Shabbos we are prohibited from engaging in specific petitional prayer, but Refuah Kravalavo, your healing is going to come soon. Veracham of Merubin, know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has much compassion. V'shifto b'shalom. And ultimately, again, may you be privileged to observe your Shabbos in peace. Good, beautiful. So we'll say, Kiman Azla Hada Amar Rabbi Chanina. So we'll say, in accordance with whose opinion is the following statement to Rabbi Chanina. Mi sheyesh lo chola b'soch beiso. So we'll say, ultimately, again, if a person has an ill person, a sick person in their family, in their home, for whom they are davening for, tzarich sheyarvena b'soch chol Yisrael. This is a beautiful idea. When you daven for someone who is ill, you never daven for that person alone. Rather, you daven for that person in the context, in the greater group of Am Yisrael. In general, when we daven for ourselves or for others, we never just daven for this, for that, for me. We daven for Klal Yisrael. But specifically for a chola, how do you know that when you're davening for a chola, halacha l'mais, you include that chola b'soch shar choli Yisrael, kiman Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say the reflexive view of Rabbi Yossi. As Rabbi Yossi said above, Rabbi Yossi said that when you go to visit a sick person, you should say, Hamakom Yirachim Alecha b'soch Chole Yisrael. So Rabbi Yossi teaches this idea, which is an incredible idea. You know, anytime you go ahead and you embed yourself within the framework of Am Yisrael, that it's not just about you, but you embed yourself in the klal, you have the ability to tap into the collective zichuyos of our people. An incredible idea. Rabbi Chanina says as follows: Bekoshi hitiru lenachim avelin. The truth is, it was under duress that the rabbis permitted us to go ahead and console mourners, go to visit mourners, and do Bikur Cholim on Shabbos. The Rabbi said the idea is that these are not really Shabbos-like activities. Why? Because a lot of times when you go to visit someone who is ill, or you do Nichum Aveilu on Shabbos, what happens? It's sad. It's sad. So it detracts from your Simcha Shabbos. But sometimes you need to be there for someone else, even if it comes at the expense of your own simcha. Actually, I quoted this Gemara in the talk that I gave last night. So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Barachana said as follows: sometimes when I would follow Rabbi Elazar around, so I'll say I would accompany Rabbi Elazar when he would go on his Bikur Cholim visits. When he would go to visit the sick, I would accompany him. And I saw something interesting. Sometimes Zimnin Amar Hamakom Yifkadech L'Shalom, the Zimnin Amar Rachamani Yatkirech L'Shalom. Sometimes he would say to the person who is ill, God should remember you in peace, or remember you for peace. So he would, that's a tefillah. Kadosh Baruch Hu should remember you for shalom. Kadosh Baruch Hu should heal you. And he would utter the tefillah in Hebrew. And other times he would say the same tefillah, Hashem should remember you for peace, but he would recite it in Aramaic. Sometimes he would do it in Hebrew, sometimes Aramaic. How could he daven in Aramaic? After all, a person shouldn't really ask his requests in Aramaic. Why not? It's because the Gemara says the Amar Rabbi Yochanan Kalashol Tzrachal V'Lashon Arami Ein Malachi Asharis Niskakin Lo. Because if you ask your request in Aramaic, the Malachim are unable to advocate on your behalf, unable to help you, unable to lobby God on your behalf. Why? She'im Malachi Asharis Makirin B'Lashon Arami. Because the Malachi Asharis, the angels, don't know Aramaic. So we'll say there's much to be said on this. There's much to be said on this on a number of levels. First of all, what does it mean that I need malachim to help lobby God? I don't need anyone to help lobby God. I can speak to God myself. I can lobby God myself. So that's a lot of discussion about it. And also this idea as to what exactly does it mean that halacha l'maisa, the malachim don't speak Aramaic. So I'll just tell you, for example, so Tosas already points out over here something fascinating. Tosas says that this is Lavadmi Gavriel. Gavriel, the Malach Gavriel apparently does speak Aramaic. So Tosas also points out something amazing. He says that we have other sources that say that the Malachim know what's in the heart of man. So you're going to tell me the Malachim know what's in my heart, but they don't understand Aramaic? Okay, so we'll have to save it to Meretz Hashem for a lunch and learn. Meretz Hashem v'shat tovim etzlachos. So, but the point of Rabbi Say is, how is it that Rabbi Elazar would go ahead and daven in Aramaic if the Malachim don't go ahead and understand Aramaic? Shiny chola de shchina imo. The chola is different. The chola doesn't need Malachim to advocate on his behalf, because the chola ultimately is right in the presence of the Shechina. The Shechina resides, the divine presence resides right by the chola. The Amarav, minayin shechina soid as a chola. How do I know that the Shechina supports a chola? Shene'emar Hashem yisaden al eresh davai. Because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu will support him on his sick bed. Tanya Nam Yachid writes that supports this. Hanichnas lavakir as a chola, lo yeshev agabi hamita, v'lo agabi kisei. If a person comes to visit the sick, he should not sit on the bed, nor should he sit on the chair. Rather, he should wrap himself, person like in his garment, as if assuming a very deferential posture, and sit before the chola. Why? Because the Shechina, the divine presence itself, rests directly above the head of the chola. Shene'emar Hashem yisadenu al eresh davai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu supports the chola, supports the sick person on his sick bed. So the Gemara said the incredible idea of Amaravin minayin she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu zanas hachola. How do we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sustains a person who is ill? Shene'emar Hashem yisadenu al eresh davai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will support him ultimately again on his sick bed. So we'll say this incredible idea that ultimately, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always with the chola. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always with the person who is ill. That whereas normally a person may need malachim to perhaps advocate on his behalf, ultimately when it comes to the chola is directly supported by the Ribbono Shel Olam. Wherever there is choli, wherever there is illness, and whenever there is a chola, HaKadosh Baruch Hu bichvodo ba'atzmo is always there as well. All right, we'll stop over here for today. We'll leave off at the 2 dots. We'll begin davening in just a few moments. Moshe is going to lead us in davening. We'll give everyone just a moment to put on talis and tefillin, and we will get started. Shekayach.